Hello guys, so I've been aware of this Twitter drama involving Laurie Penny. I haven't been following it too closely and I wasn't really planning on covering it, but when I decided to just sort of catch myself up a little bit, I did actually happen upon an angle which I think could be kind of interesting. And I figured this might be quite an easy video to make, especially seeing as right now I'm actually really starting to lean a lot more into reading and researching for some videos, and I'm actually finally properly getting started on responding to the transgender studies reader. But obviously the result of that is not only is it going to take me a decent amount of time to read each individual chapter, but also I'm going to want to do some research and some reading around some of the points covered in each chapter so that obviously it's a good response. And overall this is part of a general feeling I have right now that I want to start reading around the topic a bit more. I often tend to read around topics in phases. So I read around the gender identity stuff, first of all, kind of in 2017 when I really started basically becoming gender critical. And then I read around it around last November. The November before last, in fact, because I was working on something for my university. It was a research project and I read a lot around that. And then I'm kind of thinking I want to have another go at, reading some other stuff, maybe even catching up on some stuff which I read previously that, may have gone a bit out of my mind. So obviously because of this, it means a lot of what I'm doing in terms of work for this channel is going to be happening behind the scenes, building up my knowledge, researching, reading. So I'm still going to aim for 2 videos a week, but sometimes I might not reach that, I'm not sure. But if I don't, I just wanted to say to the people getting on Patreon, I'm, pretty much back to my regular schedule working on videos just as much as I had over the past, handful of months. And if you do want to give on Patreon, because you're not already, and you want to support what I'm doing in terms of reading and research, then that's very appreciated. Oh, and by the way, speaking of books, I always rest my microphone on a book to get it a little bit closer to my face. And today I have decided on this book by Owen Jones. And also, that's resting on top of a book about Buddhism. So I'm covering 2 different areas that are principally of interest to the worst kind of middle-class white people. So first of all, I just want to cover Laurie's original tweets to see what it is that she said. Feminism isn't just about what you believe, it's also about how you behave. If your claim to feminism boils down to spending 90% of your free time harassing trans women and their allies on twitter.com, your feminism is bad and you should feel bad. Laurie, I have a 15-year-old daughter. If she was in a woman's changing room and someone with a penis came in and took all their clothes off near her, how do you think she would feel and what would you advise her to do? Laurie responds, how am I supposed to know how she would feel? I haven't met your daughter and am not her parent, but I'd advise her not to stare at other people's genitals without their permission because it's rude. Now there are a lot of problems with this thread, so I'm going to try and break down just a few of them. So first of all, I would actually disagree with the claim that feminism isn't just about what you believe. Ultimately, if you support women's rights and women's equality, then I would say that you are a feminist. Having this quasi-religious belief that if your feminism doesn't bear fruit and if you're not focusing on your feminism in the right direction and things like that, then that means that your feminism is wrong, I just think is nonsense. The reality is that there are going to be feminists who are going to have different focuses, and there may well be feminists who are interested in spending 90% of their time focusing on gender identity issues, because gender identity issues matter to feminism. Of course, feminism should be about how women should be able to define what woman means. That's a pretty obvious, I can't imagine anything that should be more fundamental to feminism than that women should be able to have strong opinions about how woman should be defined. So if there's a large group of people saying actually women shouldn't be able to have that right, shouldn't be able to have strong opinions about how women should be defined, then of course, some significant proportion of feminists will and should be spending a significant amount of their time focusing on that. And of course, the reality is that, it says spending 90% of your time. Well, specialization is a good thing. You shouldn't have a situation where every single feminist is spending proportionally the exact amount of time on every single thing according to how important it is. The reality is that do I think gender identity issues encompass 90% of what should be of concern to women? No, but there are going to be feminist activists who specialize in gender identity issues, and they're going to spend 90% of their time focusing on that. The same way that when it comes to, sexual ethics, for example, there are going to be feminists who specialize in that, and that's their main focus, and they're going to spend most of their time focusing on that. So, yeah, I just think it's really ridiculous to kind of suggest that because there are some people who are, let's say preoccupied with talking about that particular discussion, that means that they are in some way saying that their feminism is purely focused on that, when of course it's just specialization which should exist in all activist groups. Now, of course, it also says harassing trans women and their allies, and the reality is that I'm 99% sure this just means, having honest, open debate about gender identity, about gender identity extremism and things like that. Are there people who do something which could be considered harassment to trans-identified people and people who believe in gender identity extremism? I would imagine so. There are people who can harass any group of people. Do I particularly trust Laurie Penny's perception of what constitutes harassment? Not really. But yeah, of course, if you're harassing anybody, it's not necessarily your feminism is bad. I don't really like that kind of way of talking about things. It's just being a bad human being. And oftentimes I don't think you should attach the idea of being a fundamentally good human being to a particular ideological label. It's not failing as a feminist if you're out there harassing people. You're failing as just a decent human being in general. Again, lots to disagree with. And that's before getting into the more bad tweet, the more worse tweet, which is, first of all, you have this completely it's intentionally obtuse. How am I supposed to know how she would feel? This is such a, it's just such a dumb thing to say, because obviously the reality is that we all have an ability to empathize with people. We can all actually imagine how it is that people would feel in particular situations. And this is literally when you're a kid, you learn this. You get told, how do you think, if you do something bad, you're told, how do you think this person would feel about the fact you've just done that? It's the way that you're initially taught to understand ethics. But of course, the problem is that creates issues for trans activists, because the way that we're taught to understand ethics does not support trans activism. Because, the way we're taught to understand ethics is about empathy, is about trying to understand other people, but of course trans activism is about attacking people, and therefore you can't have empathy for those people. So what Laurie does is just say, well, how am I supposed to know how she would feel? Of course, the reality is that even as she's saying that, I think she does know how this young girl would feel. I think we all know how a young girl would feel being very close to a fully naked biological male. I don't think you need to be particularly, emotionally intelligent, have a particularly strongly established theory of mind in order to work that one out. And then, it just gets more ridiculous. I haven't met your daughter, and I'm not her parent. Again, trying to, I think in a way what this is trying to do is remove responsibility. Laurie Penny, she knows that the ideology that she supports is damaging to women. So what she does, she said, well, I haven't met these people. Basically saying, that it's not my problem if it's damaging to them. Which of course is just a completely horrible attitude to have. The reality is that you shouldn't be trying to remove yourself from associating with the people who your beliefs will harm. You should be trying to understand those people. And if you have any reason to think that your beliefs will harm somebody, those should be the people you should most firmly be trying to empathize with and understand. But what Laurie is saying is, hey, I don't know anything about this. She's not my daughter, not my problem, which is, again, a really horrible attitude. And then, of course, you get, but I'd advise her not to stare at other people's genitals without their permission because it's rude. I laugh, but it's not funny. It's ridiculous. It's one of those, it's, what's the word? There's a really good word for this kind of thing. Farcical. That's what it is. It's kind of just a complete way to avoid answering a question. That's the main thing here. It's kind of it's kind of the dismissiveness of it. It's the trying as much as you can to avoid actually confronting the real issue. And the problem is, when you avoid confronting the actual implications of your beliefs in the way that Laurie Penny has just done, it shows that deep down you know that your beliefs are wrong. If somebody asks you a very obvious question about how will a young girl feel being, essentially forced in some sense to stand next to a fully grown man with, who's completely naked, in a place where she should feel safe, where she should feel secure, how is that young girl going to feel? And rather than engaging with the question, because you know that you can't engage with the question, you instead respond by, trying to dismiss the question, and then dismiss the question to the extent you're actually, in some sense, attacking the woman, implying that she's wrong for putting herself in that situation. It's so obviously wrong. And the thing is, I don't really want, like, lots of other people have covered this, and I think I don't really need to labour the point. I will say something that does need to be stressed is, of course, the reality that to understand this is wrong, it's important to understand that biological males are not women. Because Laurie Penny does, I think later on, I kind of scrolled through the comments and she was saying, well, people should have their genitals out, or people will naturally have their genitals out in changing rooms. And she was saying that to kind of distract from people making analogies to flashing. Because she's saying, hey, flashing is when you take your genitals out in a context where it is, inappropriate for you to do so. Whereas in a changing room, people are supposed to get their genitals out. But of course, that's why I would stress the importance of making clear, well, yes, if you're in a changing room, yeah, you are going to have your genitals out. And that's why it matters that we understand that if you are a biological male, you should not be in a woman's changing room because you are not a woman. If you're a biological female, even while this isn't as much of a kind of concern from a safety point, well, it's a concern for the safety of the biological female, if anything, you shouldn't be in a man's changing room because you are not a man. And I think this gets to the fundamental point that a changing room is supposed to be a place where you feel secure. And one of the reasons for that is because of the legitimacy of the segregation that inherently exists in a changing room. And what I mean by it being legitimate? Well, the segregation is based along biological sex lines. And what is being naked about? It's about exposing the fullness of your kind of biological material body. And that's why I think it's a perfectly legitimate instance to have a clear sex segregation, in the exact same sense, for example, that sports is a legitimate sex segregation because there are such pronounced biological differences when it comes to capacity in sport between males and females, indeed men and women. So, yeah, I just think that point needs to be stressed as well, just to make clear that obviously, yes, sure, it's not in principle wrong to get your genitals out in a changing room. The problem is, if you are biologically male, you shouldn't be doing that in the woman's changing room. But I did say that I had a different angle I wanted to touch on it from, and it's basically something which I've seen in particular from trans activists. I've also seen this from some other kind of woke, different political movements, and it's the no you kind of thing, like that. Nah, actually, it's you who's like that. Where basically they, let's say, trans activists in this specific example, act in a completely irrational, over-the-top, violent mob mentality kind of way. And then they realize that doesn't actually look very good for them. So then, what they desperately want is for the other side, the gender-critical people, to be as unreasonable, as irrational, as kind of violent in our language and things like that. So, I mean, I say like the no you thing. I mean, obviously there's a fancier term for this, which is sort of projection. Although I think this is almost like a more conscious projection, where it's like they're like, no, it's these guys actually. And I think obviously, so you saw, for example, J.K. Rowling, that the trans activists will pile on people for the most minor infraction. You look at what J.K. Rowling said, and she really didn't say anything particularly controversial at all, but lots of people were attacking her to the nth degree. Like, it was extreme how much people were attacking her. And I think after a while, the trans activists kind of thought to themselves, maybe this doesn't make us look so good when the entire world can see what we're doing. Wouldn't it be good if we could just say that, hey, gender critical people are doing the same thing. They're being irrational, they're being crazy. So, never mind diffusing. Let's even try to just say that they're the ones who are crazy, they're the ones who are irrational. Which is a great strategy. Unfortunately, it's contingent upon it being true, in some sense, and it's not. And you really do get the sense that trans activists are desperate for gender critical people to be these irrational people who completely go mental and attack trans people and pile on them and are completely unreasonable and crazy. And you can see that from Laurie Penny. So I'm going to read a handful of tweets. Okay, so I'm actually going to read these tweets in kind of reverse order, but it doesn't really matter because they don't necessarily follow on from each other very much. So the first tweet, not everyone will feel this way, and that's okay, but I would support anyone brave enough to walk away from the gender-critical bubble as it becomes more openly toxic and hateful. I hope many others would do the same. There needs to be an exit ramp. So here's the thing, okay, this is key because lots of gender-critical people used to support trans activism, and then they saw how crazy and hateful it was. They saw the rape threats to women who stand up for their rights. They saw the death threats talking about killing TERFs and things like that. They saw all of this stuff and they said, I don't want to be a part of this. And they walked away. And it's something which obviously gender critical people are very good at allowing. Gender critical people, it's very easy for us to say that people can leave the trans activist movement because we understand that lots of people have got caught up in this stuff because it is something that's, on an institutional level being really heavily pushed for. So lots of people are going to go along with it initially and then later on realize that actually it's kind of crazy and it's kind of dangerous and they're going to want to step away from it. So, we as kind of gender critical people are very good at having an avenue to kind of embrace that and embrace people coming in. The problem is that trans activists are not very good at that for, one obvious reason, which is that they already have institutional power on their side. They already have a situation where in the media, you really can't get away with saying that biological males can't be women. Never mind the power they have over academia, the power they have in the law, all that kind of stuff. So basically, they kind of have historically been much more likely to just attack people as soon as they put any single foot wrong. And now, of course, they have an issue where, therefore, it's quite difficult for them to, to even imagine them being like, oh, let's try and reach out to gender critical people and bring them into the fold, because that's never been their strategy before. Their strategy has been pushing for absolute purity of belief and trying to kick out anyone who disagrees on any single issue. And of course, the other issue is that Laurie Penny here is trying to argue that people will be seeing that the gender critical bubble is more openly toxic and hateful. And there's two problems with that. The first one being that there is no gender critical bubble. The gender critical people are confronted with gender identity extremism every single day. You can't, there is definitely a transgender bubble, and we know there's a transgender bubble because, if you look at the video I made on ContraPoints' subreddit, where there were people who literally had no idea what gender critical feminists believe, even remotely. There was the famous person, the big one, which I found really funny, which was the person who said that gender critical feminists are angry at trans women because they're not pretty enough. As if that's what gender critical people believe. Of course, it's complete nonsense. The point being, these people are stuck in a hell of a bubble. If they have no idea, even remotely, what gender critical people believe. And think about it, how many trans activists have you met who, especially kind of the young people who got into it through Tumblr or Discord or something like that, or from watching one of their kind of famous, trans influencers, how many of those people you meet who have no idea what gender critical feminists believe in any sense whatsoever? And then how many people is that true on the other side? How many gender critical people are there who have no idea what gender identity extremists and other trans activists believe? I expect the answer is zero, because every single gender critical person kind of became gender critical by rejecting gender identity extremism. So they already know what gender identity extremists believe, and they're saying, I don't agree with that. So immediately that there isn't a bubble, because gender critical feminism and kind of gender critical beliefs in general are about knowing what the other side believes and rejecting it. Whereas gender identity extremism is about making a series of unsubstantiated claims and then just saying that anybody who rejects it, regardless of why they reject it, you don't have to know why they reject it. It must be because they're a bigot and they hate trans people and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, there is no gender critical bubble. And then the idea that it's openly hateful and toxic. Well, the key takeaway here is, what was this a response to? What was the toxic and hateful comments a response to? Laurie Penny completely dismissing the hypothetical concerns of somebody who would be confronted with, a male naked person making them feel uncomfortable, somebody basically feeling uncomfortable and vulnerable in a very sexual situation, and Laurie Penny saying, I don't care. Yeah, it's not hateful and toxic to call that kind of behavior out. I remember seeing a while ago, I responded to that video on cancel culture, and it was saying how like sometimes cancel culture can be legitimate. And I would never say like cancelling somebody full on is legitimate, but the point I'm making is sometimes like mob outrage or something can be justified. And I would say this is a textbook example of when mob outrage about something can be 100% justified. If somebody's saying that they just don't care about the concerns of young girls when it comes to their sexual safety, that's a completely valid reason for lots of people to be outraged. So yeah, it's not ridiculous at all. And then you get this comment. I've noticed that most of the commentators who would usually be making the gender critical argument have stayed well away from the unhinged pile-on that's been happening in my mentions this week. I'm not going to name names because I don't want to make anyone else a target. Here's the thing, kid. I totally believe this is a lie. Now, I have not been following this drama very closely at all, but what I think this is trying to do is it's framing, I remember it's something which Donald Trump famously did a lot, where he basically acted as if we all knew that the reactions to him were irrational. And that's what Laurie Penny's doing here. She's kind of being like, well, it's so obvious that the reactions to me are irrational that the respectful, the genuine, the sincere gender critical people, they're not getting involved with this because they're embarrassed by the fact that other gender critical feminists care about this. Apparently that's the argument. And that seems to be what it is. Like, basically the suggestion is that gender critical feminists who care about the image of gender critical feminism, who are serious about gender critical feminism, who want to make good, compelling arguments, they're staying away from this because they are embarrassed about how the pile-on Laurie Penny makes gender critical feminism look. That's what Laurie Penny is basically trying to communicate with that comment, with that tweet. And of course, it's, again, completely ridiculous. If there is one instance where you could imagine like people are like, yes, this is making gender critical feminism look really good, it's where gender critical feminists are saying, hey, maybe you should care about the concerns women have about their own safety in vulnerable environments when it comes to biological males, being there and essentially having their genitals right in their face. It's completely like gender critical feminists going, yes, what a great opportunity to, pile on this person and show how horrible and, evil this person is for saying these things, these completely dismissive and unsympathetic things about genuine concerns that women have about their own safety. I do not believe that there are any, really serious gender critical feminists who are thinking, oh no, oh God, gender critical feminism is looking so irrational for attacking Laurie Penny right now. And again, this is what I mean when I say they're so desperate for that to be the case. And this is manipulative framing to be like, oh, you see, actually, when you think about it, I think a lot of people realize that what's happening right now is irrational and crazy. But the reality is that's not true. And the thing is, I suspect, for example, there were a lot of people who are kind of trans activists, as it were, who distanced themselves from the attacks on J.K. Rowling. Even, for example, I think Eddie Redmayne came out and basically said, he thought it was going too far. Stephen King has said, and I know that, I've spoken about Stephen King in a positive light before, and there's like disagreement on this, but Stephen King basically said, she's not hateful, she's not a bigot, he just disagrees with her. The point is, again, him, Stephen King, distancing himself from the attacks on J.K. Rowling. There have been a lot of high-profile people overtly distancing themselves from the vitriol that is behind the attacks on J.K. Rowling. And it's because, of course, most people can recognize the attacks on J.K. Rowling went way too far. And what Laurie Penny wants is for this to be the same thing. She wants it to be like, oh, and obviously there's going to be loads of people recognizing the attacks on me have gone too far. Because what's the world coming to if you can't even dismiss the concerns women have about their own safety? And of course, that's simply not true. And I do strongly suspect, okay, well, one of two things. Either one, the reason she's saying she's not naming names is because these people don't exist. Or two, the reason she's saying she's not naming names is because, well, okay, maybe this is because it's people, but they're people who are so kind of peripheral to gender critical, like they're not the like big serious gender critical feminists. Like they're people who you probably wouldn't even know. And therefore that's why she doesn't want to name their names, because people go, hold a minute, like who the hell's that? And but then of course there's the alternative, which is, and this is also possible, that she genuinely does think that some of these like people who are, whatever, gender critical feminists who've actively distanced themselves, she actually thinks they're gender critical feminists, even though they're, completely like nobody would have even heard of them. So all sorts of different options. But what I'm absolutely guaranteeing is that no, there were not serious gender critical feminists who me and you and everyone else would recognize as serious kind of high profile gender critical feminists who are out there saying, hey guys, go easy on Laurie Penny. Don't look irrational. Don't try to make yourself look crazy by attacking the person who doesn't care about women's rights but calls themselves a feminist. It's not happening. And then it's time for the final comment. The gender critical side includes a number of reasonable people who have been misled into thinking that it really is about women's rights, and I suspect many of those people are freaking out now that they can see what it's become. There has to be a dignified exit strategy. Yeah, like, hey, guess what, people? You thought that gender critical feminism was about women's rights? Well, guess what? Gender critical feminism attacks people who are totally dismissive towards the idea of women's rights. So it's got nothing to do with it. It makes no sense. Like, okay, genuinely, obviously, I mean, we all know there's no misleading people. It is about women's rights. Like, I and many other people, again, I need to stress the vast majority of people who are gender critical that I can think of are people who started off as kind of generic progressives who were kind of, interested in women's rights and also kind of, maybe even supportive or at least neutral on gender identity and things like that. And then they realized that gender identity has problems for women's rights. They realized that based on the arguments being presented. There was no misleading. Like, how do you think these people were misled? What part of it? I mean, I just genuinely don't get it. Like, and again, maybe it's my experience. Maybe my experience is incredibly unique, where I listened to the things that gender critical women said. And this is the Cliff Notes version of my experience. I listened to the things gender critical women said, and I thought, I disagree with them, but I can see where they're coming from. And then I made a video where I said, I disagree with them, but I can see where they're coming from. And then I got attacked by my own fans who said that I was, tacitly endorsing the deaths of trans people by making that comment. At that point, I realized, hold on, these people are mental. And that was kind of, and obviously it wasn't just me, like, oh, these people are mental, therefore they're wrong, they're gender critical. But that was the moment where I realized, okay, maybe actually this side is kind of crazy, and maybe this side's a bit more reasonable. And I, increased looking at those arguments and became more and more convinced. So who knows? I mean, maybe my experience was completely unique, and for everyone else, they really were misled. I mean, I know that there are the gender identity extremists who will go around Discord kind of grooming young children into accepting this idea that actually, they need these transgender glitter mummies and all that kind of stuff. But I don't think that's happening in the reverse. So then, of course, this comment about how these people must be freaking out now they've seen what it's become is just made even more like insane because, again, what happened? Laurie Penny you saw the tweets. She just said, I don't know that woman. I don't care. I don't care how she would feel. It's not my concern. I'm not her parent. I'm not her. I haven't met her. So what if she cares about having biological males in the women's changing room? Who cares? That's basically the substance of her tweet. And people got angry about that. And apparently this is supposed to be some massive revelation. And again, it's so transparent that they wish it was. They wish it was a massive revelation. And it is like they're insisting. They're so desperately insisting. Because again, for me, when I had people coming out telling me that I was murdering trans people because I thought gender critical feminists had some good points, that was a revelation. Because that was a completely unreasonable, ridiculous reaction to what I said. But that's the thing. They want, and I assume that is a very similar experience to what a lot of people had. I mean, that's basically kind of what happened with J.K. Rowling, where it's kind of, admitting that there are some concerns, some things, not saying like that trans women aren't women or anything like that, just saying there are some concerns people have with contemporary trans activism, and then they get completely dogpiled. They get, told that they're killing people and things like that. People look at that and they say, that's unreasonable. That's irrational. You are an absolute lunatic for saying that. And what gender identity extremists want so badly is for there to be some equivalent on the other side. And they're so desperate for it that even as they're being, like justifiably made fun of and attacked for, dismissing women's concerns about their own safety, they'll say, when you think about it, this is kind of like when J.K. Rowling was told she was killing trans people because she said she had some concerns about free speech and things like that. It's completely ridiculous. And again, it just smacks of desperation. And yeah, that final comment, there has to be a dignified exit strategy. I just love the idea that there are people going, oh man, how can I leave the gender critical movement with my dignity? Because, I just feel like there's nothing dignified about standing up for the rights of women. So how am I gonna leave this now? It's complete nonsense. Again, it's kind of what these people are doing is they're inventing a narrative that doesn't exist. This narrative that there are gender critical people who think that Laurie Penny has been in some way attacked unjustifiably, that the attacks being made against her are not completely rational and in proportion to the severity of kind of the immorality of what she said, that's just nonsense. I don't think there's anybody who's going like, oh god, the gender critical movement went too far attacking Laurie Penny. No. And then obviously the idea that there are serious kind of gender critical people thinking, oh no, how are we going to leave this movement because it's become crazy? The gender critical movement's become crazy, guys. It's like, oh, the gender critical movement is falling apart. Meanwhile, the gender critical movement is actually like catapulting into quite meaningful success in terms of popularity and, like people actually taking it a lot more seriously, people understanding it's not about hating trans people and things like that. And, it's something I've seen in other political movements and other even kind of religious and philosophical movements where it's this sense of like, you get to a point where it's so cult-like and it's so disconnected from reality that you can look at what's being said and you can say, okay, so I now know the opposite to that is the case. So if they're saying there are gender critical people looking for a dignified exit strategy, what they mean is gender critical people are really happy with how the gender critical movement is looking so much more rational and sane compared to the lunacy of the gender identity extremist movement. If they're saying gender critical people want to leave the gender critical movement, what they actually mean is lots of gender identity extremists want to leave the gender identity extremist movement because they see how crazy it is. Whatever they say is it's the opposite of what's the truth. Like that's the point. You get to a point of delusion. You get to a point where you're trying to manipulate the narrative so much that you've convinced yourself. And I think I've said that before, where about how the gender identity extremists, they say all of this stuff. And you might want to frame it as being that, them being manipulative and them being intentionally duplicitous. But the reality is that they are lying to themselves as much as they're lying to anyone else. They're not consciously saying like, I'll pretend this is the case. They genuinely, like deep down, they're so desperate for this to be the case that they've convinced themselves it is. I firmly believe that. And I think you can see that with Laurie Penny, that even as she's being made fun of for her completely horrible anti-feminist remarks about women's safety and women's security in women's private places, she's telling herself, actually, I'm the victim here, and lots of people can recognize how irrational the attacks are against me. Keep telling yourself that. Anyway, that's the end of the video. So please do like, share, comment, and subscribe. Again, if you'd like to give on Patreon, I really appreciate it. But obviously, give within your means, and if your means are nothing, that's fine. I will also say that I do have another video covering a Laurie Penny video, which I will leave in the end card, so if you stick around to the end card, you'll see that. But before then, I'll just say thank you to my current patrons: Hannah, Kirsten, Stephen, Nancy, Rubble, Lizu, Jessica, Constant, Adriana, Harper, Alex, Leica, Jane, George, Katie, Ryan, Vishnuvius, That Feminist, Lily, Emily, Frederico, Evan, Philip, Anna, Sophie, Jamie, Lena, Julie, Dustin, Rashmi, Marion, BJ, Joshua, Marina, Sam, Sarah, Kathleen, Jelena, Alexandra, Emma, Owen, Sarah, Ibishka, Chris, Clara, Amy, Gifka, Corey, Grape, Rays, Janet, Vince, Colin, Radio, OMG, Sad, Barnaby, Windsprite, Emma, Doubting, Chris, Gail, My Dude, Esme, Marcel, Rachel. You're all very appreciated.